Given the difficulty that we had with tutorial 2 and the proximity of assignment 1, I thought the best thing that we could probably do would be for me to put my thoughts together in relation to assignment 1 and record what I was going to say in tutorial 2. So part of the focus of tutorial 2 was always going to be to review module 1 with a view to seeing if we could identify some of the issues that were emerging that students could begin thinking about for their assignment. So as you'll recall, the context for your assignment is that a new bishop has arrived and is trying to gain a better understanding of some of the issues that are related to religious education in your context or one with which you are familiar, and you're to make a presentation in which you identify some of the key issues, drawing on both your professional practice. So for teachers who are currently working in this area in schools as either a coordinator or a teacher, you would draw on your current practice, or for people who are not currently in a school, to at least draw on a situation with which you are familiar. And the other thing is the scholarly literature. So basing it on the readings that we have provided in this unit, and also other ones that you have probably come across in the course of your research. I've had a few students ask me, what does a referenced script look like? And essentially it looks very much like an essay. So it's the text that you would provide to a speech that you might give that might at some point in the future be published in a journal. So for that reason we use APA referencing, and if you go to the library website there are some good guides on that. So in the first tutorial we had a good look at module 1A and 1B, and in that tutorial we had a look at some of the research related to new teachers of religious education, and we spent a fair bit of time talking about some of the mental images out of which people work, which in turn shape the way in which they approach the subject. So some of the issues that we looked at which could be appropriate for assignment 1 were the needs of new religion teachers, and then also the ongoing training needs of people who are continuing. The second one that we looked at was the multifaceted nature of the role, and the third one, which I touched upon, was the role of technology, which changes the relationship in many ways, especially between the coordinator, the local Catholic Education Office, and the teacher of religious education. So one of the things that I particularly wanted to look at in tutorial 2 was the sort of state of religious education in Catholic schools and religiously affiliated schools today. And I started with some graphs from the National Catholic Education Commission, which highlighted a number of things. First of all, it highlighted the number of people from other Christian traditions or other world faiths who are in our school, and it's not insignificant at 30%. I also drew attention to the number of First Australians, of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are in our community, who also, when we discuss this issue in terms of religious education, we need to be very aware of. So that was one of the first things that we sort of had a look at in terms of how does the Catholic school today respond to the multicultural and multi-faith nature of the school itself. So one of the things which underlies and underpins the multicultural and multi-faith nature of our schools is the phenomenon of pluralism. So one of the things that we looked at was a Congregation of Catholic Education document, a very recent one from 2013, which looked at the issue of pluralism. And instead of seeing it as potentially a problem, it saw it very much as an opportunity to gain a better understanding both of the traditions of other people, and in that I'm including people who profess no particular religious faith. And in coming to a better understanding of other people, we come to a better understanding of our own faith. So one of the questions that I posed, and again this could well be an issue worthy of exploration, is if we're going to do that, if we're going to dialogue with people of other faiths and other traditions, what sort of understanding of the home tradition of the school does a student need to possess in order to be able to do that satisfactorily and successfully. Possibly in days gone by, the issue of interreligious dialogue would have been something which would very much have been related to the senior school, study of religion, religion and ethics, and courses of that nature. But increasingly, we're seeing in the curriculum of the junior and middle school a greater awareness of other religious traditions, especially Judaism. So the question of how well we need to understand the home tradition of the school first becomes a very, very important one. The document by the Congregation of Catholic Education is quite interesting. It highlights two possible ways that we can approach pluralism. One is what it calls assimilation, where we just simply say that the person of another faith just has to join us and be one of us, and I'm using that word very deliberately. Or alternatively, a relativist approach is adopted where one religion is as good as the other and no value judgments are made. And it says that there's problems with both of those approaches. The interesting thing about the approach that the congregation takes is that it sees pluralism, as you can see in the words that I've highlighted there, as a resource, as something which can open up dialogue between people in a very, very profound way. So this has implications for how we treat students in our school who might belong to a different tradition. The relationship, therefore, between people in the Catholic school who belong to the home tradition and those who belong to other traditions becomes something in the multi-faith nature of the contemporary school that's something which is something of an issue which needs exploration. One of the things I particularly like about the document is that it's quite realistic. So as you can see on this slide, it notes that the theme of interreligious encounter is simply unavoidable in the modern school, and that this therefore has implications for educational pedagogy. So, and it goes on to talk about that in a fair amount of detail before it even gets to religious education. It makes it very, very clear that this is an issue which the entire Catholic school must deal with. It's not just simply the domain of the religion teacher to deal with this phenomenon of pluralism. It's something which every teacher in a Catholic school must take some responsibility for in their own particular areas. So if we link this back to some of the research that we encountered earlier on the needs of new religion teachers, one of the things that becomes very, very clear is the need to be able to recontextualize Christian teaching in a way that will make sense to people today, regardless of the background of the student in front of us. Of course, a number of dioceses across Australia have taken this quite seriously, and the issue of recontextualisation is one which, depending on your context, might be one that you would like to investigate further. Now, after it talks about pedagogy in the Catholic school in general terms, the congregation then go on to talk about religious education, and it makes the point, as it does in pretty much every document it's released since the 1970s, of the distinction between religious education and catechesis. Now, one of the things, if we link this back to almost the first article that I asked people to read in Module 1, there are going to be stakeholders out there that are not going to be comfortable with that distinction. And yet one of the things that the school needs to do, as the document says, is it has to open students' knowledge about Christianity's identity and the Christian life in general. So again, the focus of the school needs to be on the acquisition of literate knowledge. It becomes the responsibility of our partners in religious education, and indeed in the religious life of the school, for students to then have an opportunity to practice what they have learned in the religion classroom itself. So this raises again the fundamental question about how we understand the nature and purpose of religious education in a Catholic school or a religiously affiliated school today. In turn, this has implications for what Graham Rossiter calls subject orientations and he went through over 20 ways in which our fundamental understanding of the nature and purpose of religious education is affected by and affects the approach that we take to religion in the school. So essentially that was the ground that we covered in tutorial 2, which leads us to module 2. As with the modules in this unit, there's 3 topics in this particular module. The first one looks at religious education as an agent of personal change. The second module, module 2b, looks at the place of prayer. And the third module looks at the interpretation of Scripture. And if you've had a chance to have a look at the material, you'll realise that in this module we've drawn very heavily on the work of Professor Graham Rossiter. Now, depending on the subject orientation that a person is operating out of, one of the things that will be an expectation is that religious education can act as an agent of personal change. So the first thing that I would encourage you to do if you're considering this as an issue for your assignment is to look at the subject orientations in a fair amount of detail and look at how and why those particular orientations see this as important. But as you go through that material, I'd also encourage you to consider the ethical considerations of that. And by that, what I mean is, to what extent can and should a teacher or a coordinator be trying to deliberately shape or change the beliefs, values and attitudes of students in their class. We'll be looking in one of the later modules at the question and the issue of an ethical code of conduct for religion teachers. But if you're looking at this issue of RE as an agent of personal change, I'd encourage you to be very aware of it now. Module 2b then moves on and looks at the place of prayer in the religion curriculum. And again, depending on your subject orientation, for some this is an absolute no-brainer. But this works at both ends of the spectrum. There are people who would see this as absolutely fundamental and at the core of what religion does, and there would be others who adopt a phenomenological approach who would want to make the distinction about studying about the prayer rather than participating in it in the religion classroom. And there's arguments on both sides of that. Graham Rossiter has a very, very good presentation of this in Module 2b, so I'm not going to go through the material that he goes through, but I want to highlight that again the place of prayer is one of the things which, depending on your diocese, there will be different approaches to. For example, in the Archdiocese of Brisbane where I work, we have a recontextualist approach to the teaching of religion, but there is also mandated prayer, which at particular year levels there is an expectation that students will be taught about those prayers, and through the religious life of the school there will be experiences provided that will enable those students to participate in that particular form of prayer. So Module 2c, the final module in Module 2, looks at the issue of the interpretation of Scripture. And again, I've provided some readings about what a Catholic approach to the interpretation of Scripture actually is, and then I've provided the lecture that Graham Rossiter has given in relation to the educational dimension of the issue. So the 2 things I suppose that I want to stress as you go through this material is the need in a Catholic school for a genuine Catholic interpretation of Scripture. And the second thing to keep in mind is that in pretty much any school today, there will be teachers, parents and students who hold fundamentalist beliefs in relation to the interpretation of Scripture. So taking on board what the Congregation for Catholic Education said when we were looking at pluralism, one of the things that we need to look at here is how can we look at that more as an opportunity for dialogue and discussion rather than as a threat. But at the end of the day, the thing that is most important is that there is a genuine Catholic interpretation of Scripture which is provided in Catholic schools, and the same would be true in any religiously affiliated school. Whatever the particular tradition happened to be, it would be very, very important that that tradition's approach to Scripture is reflected throughout the teaching of religion in that school. So finally, in addition to the suggestions that already were made in assignment 1 in the unit outline, just a few of the thoughts I've had as I've worked through modules 1 and 2 with you. And I suppose there's 4 key issues which come through to me. The first one, and the big one, is the issue of pluralism, because the phenomenon of pluralism affects everything that a person does, a teacher or a coordinator does in a Catholic school. But drawing on the document of the Congregation for Catholic Education, we need to see pluralism more as an opportunity than a threat. And that would be the first big issue that I would name that comes through these 2 modules. The second one, which I think is almost unavoidable, is the relationship between the subject orientation that a coordinator or a teacher is operating out of and the understanding that that person has on the nature and purpose of religious education, because that will affect where the emphasis is placed in terms of the curriculum material that is taught. And underpinning that is the mental image of the teacher and the coordinator that a person will have and that a person will operate out of. The third issue, which I think is quite important, is the issue about the ethical considerations that are inherent in teaching and coordinating religion today. Because in many ways, it's not like some of the other subjects in the curriculum of the school. There are specific ethical considerations that religion teachers need to be aware of. And we looked at that when we looked at the material on being an agent of change and the place of prayer. So that's the third big issue that comes through for me. And then the fourth issue, as I have alluded to, is the issue of the interpretation of Scripture, and within the context of the Catholic school, resisting fundamentalist interpretations of that, but doing that in a way in which it's possible to dialogue with people who have different approaches to how Scripture is to be understood today. So finally, in conclusion, best of luck with assignment 1. If you have any questions, please feel free to put those on the discussion forum or to send me an email, and I'd be more than happy to respond. Hopefully the material that I've gone through in this presentation will give you a few ideas as you're trying to shape your assignment. So best of luck, and I look forward to reading them as they come in next week.